We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you for today's Bridge Innovates Inspire series webinar on creative placemaking as a community building practice. We're going to have our guest speaker, Tamara Gatchell, joining shortly to share her insights. So without further ado, we'll get started. So for those of you that are joining us for the first time, maybe, my name is Mary Kim. I'm a senior consultant at Bridge Innovate. Bridge Innovate is a global network of business strategists, consultants, and designers that team up with you to spark distinctive design, courageous leadership, and agile change to transform organizations and businesses for growth and good. So the goal of our Inspire series that you're joining in today, and maybe you have joined in the previous one, is to share valuable insights and lessons to support your innovation journey. So we love having leaders that spark inspiration and hopefully motivate you to start or build momentum on your innovation journey. So today, I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker, Tamara Gatchell. Tamara is a principal with Bridge Innovate and serves as research and technology leader. And she has led many community strategy projects and engagements these past several years for Bridge. In addition to her work at Bridge, she also leads Cadence Creative. She's a principal. And of course, today she's joining from Albany, New York. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Tamara for her to share her inspiration with us.
Thank you, Mary. We thought we would start out talking about creative placemaking and creative community building. If you could just use the chat feature to, what's your favorite town or a city that you love to visit? Let's just see what comes up. When you think of a place that feels vibrant to you and that you like to Savannah, Georgia. We've got Mary. New Orleans. Charleston. I'm going to have to look at that town in Pennsylvania because that's one I don't know. Okay, Estes Park in Colorado. Sleepy Hollow, New York. Oh, that's up my way. Okay. So when we think about creative placemaking, so what is it about that place that you love, and how do you feel when you visit? Does anyone want to share something about how they feel when they're in New Orleans? Energized, okay? And hungry, connected. So Rachel, I think we're going to move forward and we're going to build pedestrian scale and intimate. Okay, so there's this human pedestrian scale and it's intimate, and you have this feeling of happiness. You're energized, you're connected. I mean, these are all good feelings that as we think about creative placemaking, that's really what we're doing. We're building a sense of community for those that live in a place, and we're also building a sense of community for those who are coming to visit. So if we go ahead and move in, I'd like to just share to our next slide and keep the places that you like to visit coming, because I always like to look at them and see what aspects of those places are people drawn to. So how did I get involved with creative placemaking? As Mary mentioned, I'm a collaboration partner and a principal with Bridge Innovate, and we do a lot of design work with corporations and with nonprofits, and we help them to solve problems and see new opportunities, and just a lot of really rich and good work. And in 2016-2017 timeframe, our CEO, Jenny Whitener, had an idea, and she reached out to Thrive Regional Partnership and the Lyndhurst Foundation and said, what if we used our design thinking approaches to help community teams develop arts and cultural vibrancy strategies for their town or city? Wouldn't it be interesting to do that? And so Thriving Communities was launched, and I was one of the coaches that worked with the community teams who were doing that. And what was really neat about the program was that it was a cohort model. that there were a number of different teams that were all developing strategies at the same time, and then periodically they would come together and they would share what they were learning. So that was an aspect of the program that I just absolutely loved the work. And then the National Consortium for Creative Placemaking had a summit that was happening in Chattanooga. And so we decided, why don't we share some of the work we're doing at the summit? And I was just very energized by the kind of response that we got when we shared how we were using design thinking to develop arts and cultural strategies. We shared some of the work we were doing. People seemed really receptive and interested, but what was even more fun about it was that we started to learn what were others doing in the region that we weren't, that we didn't know about. So it gave me a sense of how much more there was to learn. And so I signed up for a 10-month program with the National Consortium that was a certificate program that I completed in 2019. So that's kind of my background. And I consider myself a creative community builder, really. And I consider myself to be a practitioner that's always evolving and wanting to learn about other practices that others are using. So if we look at the National Endowment for the Arts on this next slide, they have a definition of creative community building. And I like the fact that they use the word evolving in this, because again, I feel like I'm evolving as a practitioner, but they're pointing out that creative placemaking is an evolving field of practice that intentionally leverages the power of arts, culture, and creativity to serve a community's interest while driving a broader agenda for change, growth, transformation, in a way that also builds character and quality of place. So some of those places that you listed, like New Orleans, when you think of it, there's a lot going on there that's happening in New Orleans that's drawing on the power of arts and culture and creativity. And then is what's happening in New Orleans driving kind of that broader agenda for how they'd like to see their community grow. So when I think about like the evolving nature of creative placemaking, it makes me think about some of the work of the Kresge Foundation. And their president, Rip Rapson, has said that they really want to invest in creative placemaking. And they want to look at what new opportunities there are to do that. And he says, we'd really like to see art, culture, and community engaged design be something that's knitted into all of these other kind of disciplines that a lot of times are approached kind of in a siloed way. So he's saying, how can we knit it in a patchwork to questions of land use and housing and transportation and health and well-being of communities in a way that our communities can become stronger and more equitable and more vibrant? So he's saying we're kind of going to get behind this, and they did a white paper recently, Dr. Jackson, out of Arizona State University. And one of the things that she is pointing out, again, is this opportunity for the practice to evolve and to become even more equitable. And that we have to be asking ourselves those kind of ethical questions as we're doing our work. Are we drawing on cross-sector relationships? Are we making sure that all community members are at the table? So these are some really good questions, provided this as a link for those on the call to look at afterwards. So another influence of mine, because our artists are so important to this work that we're doing, is Dar Williams, and I don't know how many of you might be familiar with her. I have not seen her play, but she's a musician, and she wrote a book called What I Found in 1,000 Towns, and I think it really speaks to me about what I care about as a creative community builder. And I think I saw it a lot in the community teams that I worked with, where I saw them really building momentum for the strategies that they were building. And Dar talks about there were certain places that she visited that she just said, I want to go back there. They're so vibrant, it's so welcoming, and there's so many good things going on. And she said that those places had this quality of what she calls positive proximity. And what is positive proximity? Well, she says it's a state of being where just the fact of living side by side is beneficial. It's experienced as a benefit. And the places that she wanted to return to, she felt that they had this sense of positive proximity. So you could think about that as an example of Say you have a bookstore on Main Street and a small entrepreneurial coffee shop moves in next door. Well, does that have a different sense of beneficial living side by side to your bookstore than if it was a big box or a chain entity that moved in next door to you? So thinking about the way that spaces create experienced benefit based on who's in that space together. So she said she noticed that there were certain patterns of positive proximity. One was that the places, the towns were designed so that good interactions could happen between people who were just happening by. So there were good spaces for in the outdoor and the indoor to do that. They also had a strong identity. So the towns had really invested and tried to understand and to become most themselves. So they were investing in their cultural and their historical traditions. And then the other aspect that I just think it's so incredibly important is that this ethos of all boats rising. So she said, where there is positive proximity, there are people working in communities, and she calls this abstract quality translation, where there's a commitment to bring in all the different voices, but not only to bring in the voices. I think this is really nuanced. To also bring in, how can you connect with people's capabilities? And then if someone is kind of having a tough time, how do we offer support in our community to help them kind of get back on their feet? So this idea of how are we interacting with each other? So it's a really lovely book. I would recommend it. And Dar goes on to say, and I think this is really timely to where we are right now. She says that what I have found in towns that have high positive proximity is that they're interested in fighting poverty and racism. They're looking to be inclusive, to find bridges so that there's a kind of prosperity for all and there's a quality of life for all. And she says, I encourage everyone in your own way to think in bridges. So how do we build these relationships in our communities? And that quote just really spoke to me because when I was in the certificate program, something that was just emphasized so often was this notion of social capital. So how are the relationships, the networks of relationships that exist within a place, how do they enable or how do they create the conditions for us to function effectively? So if we want to build something new in our community, it's really important whether we have these networks of relationships. And there's two different kinds as well. One is the in-group relationships. So you think about in your community, if you have teachers, do they have a high level of trust and are they able to work effectively together? And what about your small businesses? Do they share ideas and do they have good camaraderie between the work that they're doing? And what about your municipality? So there's kind of this trust and this effectiveness that happens in group, but then there's these really important bridging relationships that happen where you notice, I think whenever you're doing creative community building or creative placemaking, you can probably all imagine the person that I'm talking about who just knows everyone and can understand the perspectives that different people have. They're like a bridging capital. So it's that kind of strong relationships between those that might not be in your primary group that you identify with. And Dar Williams talks about that these conscious bridgers, the people that kind of navigate between, are always looking for new alliances and new connections. And what we have found in the field of creativity is that the more that you can understand the perspectives of the different groups, the more you come up with more creative ideas. You see things from maybe a different framework or a different point of view, and new ideas open up. So if we go to the next slide, and I think about, you know, the 16 community teams that we worked with over the course of time, those that really started to build a momentum for some of the work that they were doing, something that I really noticed about them was that they used every opportunity as an opportunity to connect and to learn something new about those that they were working with. So creative community building happens what I consider experientially. So as we are having experiences together, each of those encounters offers an opportunity for us to create connection, to build relationships, to have a better understanding of where different, parties are coming from. And because we do that, I think it allows us to take more generative, empathic, informed, and intentional action. So this relationship between creating connections and then taking more nuanced action, or action that feels more culturally relevant to a place, I think it's very important. So let's kind of move out of the conceptual and go into, a few examples of these encounters as you're doing creative placemaking, where you really can leverage it as an opportunity, or leverage is such a wrong word. You can celebrate it, or you can come at it with the perspective of it being an opportunity to create relationship and see something new. So one of the things that we start with in creative community building is really understanding what assets exist today within the place that we are. And traditionally in community development, there tended to be more of a needs orientation. So if you think of needs orientation, it would be, oh, our town, it's not great. This other town over here has this summer music series and everyone comes and has such a good time. We don't have anything like that. So that would be kind of a needs oriented. We really need to come up with something like that for our community. But asset mapping is very different. It's an alternative approach where you start to really look at what already exists in our community. And the model that we like to use, there's so many different approaches to cultural and arts asset. We like to use the one from the Community Partnership for Arts and Culture out of Cleveland. And the reason that we like to use this model is it thinks very, very broadly about what an asset is in a community. It can be a person, it can be a story that's told, it can be heritage properties, it can be a public museum. So you're thinking very, very broadly about what is here now in this place where I am with these others. What exists here now? So if we go to the next slide, you can see here's a picture of us doing some asset mapping with a community. And asset mapping is not a consultant deciding what assets exist. It's a community coming together and discovering together and sharing what assets they know about in their community. So it's very action-oriented in that people are writing and they're thinking. So what assets exist today that we want to discover, uncover, recognize, and celebrate? It's a very celebratory process. And as an observer, when I'm working with the community, because I may not know what assets exist, it's so fascinating to be kind of a fly on the wall and see how people are like, oh, I didn't know that the high school was doing a poetry slam, or I didn't know that that person was involved with ceramics and was teaching at the community center. So it's this way that, again, if you think about these encounters, these activities that we're doing as we're creative placemaking, it gives us a chance to talk with those that we live with in the same community. So one of the things that we built on from this idea of doing asset mapping, because asset mapping is done very widely in creative placemaking, we would take it a second step, and we would, Mary, can you go back just 1 second to the other slide? We would take it a second step after the community members had looked at everything that existed in their community. We would then ask them to take a second step and say, now what aspirations do you have and what ideas do you have? So then you're approaching it not from a place of deficiency, but from a place of, wow, we have all of these assets, and we'd also like to see this other thing that connects with what's already here. So it again becomes very generative, and again, relationships are formed because people feel good. They've just gone through all of these things that exist, and now they're coming up with ideas together. It's a real opportunity to share and for people to get to know each other. So another tool that we use as we're doing using design thinking and creative placemaking is the idea of interviewing. You want to understand what's the perspective of different stakeholder groups that are in your community. And I'm sure some of you have seen that interviewing can be a very boring, mundane kind of an activity. You could call someone up on the phone and say to them, what do you think about our town? What's going well? What's not? And it could be a short conversation, and then you could be done, and you could type up your notes and be finished. But again, I think it's a missed opportunity for creating new relationships, new understanding, and just a feeling of connection. And I think it was pretty magical how one of the teams approached this. They identified a stakeholder group that they wanted to interview. And there was a group of 25 men that lived at a residential addiction treatment home in their town. And they decided that they wanted to know what was their perspective about the community and what did they think needed to be built. And so instead of going and interviewing them, they set up time to come and they cooked a meal for them. And then they sat down, and over the course of dinner, they had discussions about, what matters to you about our community? What would you like to see here? And they learned a lot about the folks that lived there, had a common concern around the desire for youth having programs that they could be involved with before maybe they went astray. So forming programs for youth. But it didn't end with just the interview process. I think there was a really good example of how this team really did create connections when they got to the phase of the work that we do, where they had to put on a pop-up experiment event. Some of the men from the residential home came and helped them set up for the experiment event. So they had created a connection there that carried through the work that they were doing. Now, the couple of men that came to help them, they didn't stay for the experiment event when the music started, but they came and helped them set up, and I think that there were some new relationships formed there. So the last example that I would share is around experimentation. When we're doing creative placemaking with communities, we ask them to do this asset mapping, to do interviewing, and then to start to think about ideas that they have where they think they can connect or amplify different arts and cultural assets that they have, or maybe something new that they could create. So we ask them to put on an experiment that kind of mimics what they're trying to build. So it can be a pop-up event. And this is another place where we just saw such an opportunity for creating relationships again. Because if you were just to come up with ideas and then immediately move into seeking funding and then building something, it doesn't give your community members an opportunity to provide you with feedback or ideas about the design that you have. And I think there's also something about when people see that a design is not finalized and they're being asked to engage, they really feel like they have something to offer. And then there's also a feeling of investment as to what's happening. And I'll just kind of end on this last point, which is around having fun. I think that when we're doing creative placemaking and creative community building, there is such an opportunity to bring in our artists and our volunteers to play music and do chalk art and have a drumming session or do some painting and share food like the one team did during the interviewing. And when we're problem solving, doing some of that ahead of time, I think creates connections, and it puts us in a different feeling place that, one, we become more creative, and two, I think we feel more connected to and perhaps more open to hear the perspective of others. So just a couple of points that I would say, that it was amazing what these teams accomplished. They really became conveners where when they started to do work, people in their community were like, oh, we want to be a part of this. And then starting with a vision and then drawing others in to help evolve and build it out. Using your pop-up events and experiments to draw in community members who might not have a seat at the table. Again, that idea of positive proximity where you're bringing in the voices of the full community and also their capabilities. And then again, this last piece around having fun, combining fun and reflection. And for those of you that are interested, I don't know if any of you have seen the Creative Community Builders Handbook. This is one by Tom Borup. He was one of our professors in the certificate program, and it is an excellent reference book that gives you ideas. It has 5 different case studies that are focused on building strong economies through the use of arts and culture, and the other one is focused very much on how do we build social connections. So I will stop there and Mary, see if we have just a couple minutes for questions.
Thank you, Tamara. And for those of you, we had several links that were embedded to the presentation. We'll go ahead and share those links in the follow-up meeting to all those that registered for the event, along with the recording. And we have just a couple minutes before we wrap up. So if there are any questions, feel free to use the chat feature. We'll wait a second for you to flex your finger muscles and type in a question, a burning question for Tamara, and we'll wrap up shortly. Are there any questions on creative placemaking, community building, or any comments in general you'd like to share?
It would be interesting to hear if anyone is using these types of, or have seen the way that connections are formed using some of these tools as well, if you have any experiences to share. Or but please feel free to reach out as well.
Great. Maria from Portugal, have you had any experience with post-disaster recovery?
That's a really interesting, question, Maria. I have not had any personal experience with that, but I have seen in, if you go back to that idea of social capital, I think that the communities that have those relationships that are both in group and bridging have a much different experience in post disaster recovery, when those connections are already established in a community ahead of time. I think it makes a very big difference. I saw that in the city of Schenectady, which is close to me, after the Black Lives Matter, some of the Floyd demonstrations, where there was a moment in time when some of the protests were going on, and it felt very volatile, and there were some relationships between a very young college-aged woman, and she was talking to the chief of police, and they were having a very kind of animated discussion, but they were able to bridge and see each other's kind of perspectives, and it really de-escalated a situation that I think could have gone in a different direction. And so I think when you have these relationships, across different groups, it really makes a difference.
Okay, we have a couple more questions coming in, and I understand that we are at time. So one of the things we can do is, if anyone's able to stay on a little longer, we'll wrap up and maybe continue to answer a couple more questions, and we'll formally wrap up. So we'll come back to those questions, Christine and Sarah. For those of you that have to jump off, we're right at noon. We do have upcoming, actually we have a couple of more that you might be interested in for those of you that are focused on community vibrancy, community building. We have one with Lilo coming up on learning labs to respond to community challenges. It looks like many of you are interested in kind of navigating the disruptions and the pandemic that many of the communities, or if not all, are facing. So look for those more information at bridgeinnovate.com events tab. And those of you who are interested in building competency in community vibrancy strategy, especially for our community leaders, organization leaders, we do have an upcoming program in August 17th for 3 weeks that's coming up as well. And you're welcome to reach out to me directly to receive any additional information or questions you have. So we are going to wrap up. And for those of you that have to jump off, thank you so much for joining today. And thank you, Tamara. And for those of you who like to stick around and hear Tamara's answers to a couple of these questions, feel free to do so. We are going to continue recording. So if you want to listen to the answer but have to jump off, feel free to rewatch the recording to get the answer. So Thank you, everyone. Give everyone a second. All right.
So Christine had a question, Mary, about
Yes.
navigating, this topic during the pandemic. I had hosted as a guest facilitator a podcast for the National Consortium for Creative Placemaking, and there is a really fantastic nonprofit group called O Positive that is in the Hudson Valley of New York, and they were talking, and what they do is they bring together artists at different festival events, and they bring the artists there, and then healthcare providers come while these events are happening, and they offer services. So it is this kind of an exchange where healthcare providers in the broader community are able to come and listen to the music and enjoy themselves over a festival weekend. And then artists who may be underinsured or have no insurance are receiving healthcare that they need. This organization, as the pandemic happened, they found that all of those relationships that they had created with artists across the country and with healthcare providers more kind of regionally in the Hudson Valley, that they have become a real source of helping the needs of the community during the pandemic. So they have been acting as connectors. And I think their example, and if you go to the National Consortium, you can hear the podcast. I think that's an example of how when you have different groups in a community that are connected, it's kind of like that idea of positive proximity, when it's beneficial that you're there together. So I think communities that have higher degrees of positive proximity, I would say that they've had an easier time mobilizing resources than maybe those that don't have as much of that, social capital, those resources to move into action. I don't know if that answers your question.
All right. And it looks like, Tamara, you already answered. Christine's is great recommendation. Thank you.
Yes, if anyone has questions about the certificate program, please, Mary, I think you're going to share my email.
Yeah.
You could reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk to you about the program. I really enjoyed the program. They have excellent instructors. It was excellent. And you also are connected in with some of the summits that are going on. So it's a really neat way to open up your perspective as to different approaches to creative placemaking that are being used regionally and globally as well in some cases.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for spending that extra 5 minutes with us to hear Tamara's answers. And Tamara, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today on creative placemaking and building community vibrancy. And we will be sharing the recording. So if you'd like to revisit this material, feel free to jump back on, and we will hopefully see you next time. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.